Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited about this topic. I think it couldn't be more timely. It is Lincoln's birthday. We also have a few things going on in the world where having a good example of how to hold a political conversation would probably be a great idea. And on a personal note, I'm also just looking forward to this to be able to spend time with Tom Stipanowich. When I started at Pepperdine in 2004, I believe, Tom, you were just leaving CPR, where you had steered them for quite a few years. You came over to Pepperdine, joined Peter Robinson there, and brought all of your experience as an arbitrator, a mediator in the commercial realm, and what I'm hoping many of you know about Tom, if you don't, this will be abundantly clear, is that he's a fantastic mediator, fantastic arbitrator, really interesting professor, but he's also incredibly creative. So the paintings, the drawings that he's done of Lincoln, as well as of other things, and the books that he has written, and the one that he's in the middle of writing, it just shows that. Tom, you're an incredibly gifted person, and I just thank you for spending time with us today. It's been such an honor to know you these past couple of decades, and I always enjoy when I get to sit and learn from you. So, just on the personal note, just had to pause for a second and say thank you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. That means so much coming from you, a treasured colleague and friend. I'm so delighted to see all of you today. So many familiar faces, so many people who I know and love. And I'm just delighted that we can all celebrate Lincoln's birthday today. I think Lincoln, whatever one's uh, political persuasion, let's face it, Lincoln sort of occupies a special place. And what I'm going to do is jump right into the slideshow. I have quite a few pictures for you today, so you don't have to look at me and the misleadingly green picture of Malibu behind me. Right now, it looks a lot blacker than that, but at least we made it through the latest round of fires. Um, let's go to the slideshow and let's see if I can go ahead and bring up the the Lincoln Way. Do you all see the slide? Okay. So, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. Um, Here's a picture of Lincoln in the town square, my hometown. Of course, that's part of Lincoln Land. And let's face it, it's not just in Western Illinois or Central Illinois that people talk about or are consumed by Lincoln. Lincoln is a part of our daily lives as Americans. And here's even a cookbook that we were sent recently about apparently some of Lincoln's favorite dishes. So it's all Lincoln all the time. Uh, if you're an American, why Lincoln? Why this fascination with Abraham Lincoln that is carried with us throughout much of our history? And why are there something like 20,000 books having been written on him? And why are Carly Conklin and I working on yet another book about Lincoln, one that we hope will be a little different? Well, some years ago, I looked at the recent C-SPAN historians polls. And I was shocked at how Lincoln dominated the polls. Not only was his overall ranking the highest year after year, but if you look at all the different categories of leadership by which you might measure the performance of a president, look at where Lincoln fares. He shows up at or near the top in almost every category. Of course, Lincoln made a contribution that is unique in the history of civil rights in this country. I never stopped to think it was a full 300 years before the Civil War that we first had African slaves brought to this continent by the Spanish, 1565. And it wasn't until 1865 that there was an abolition of slavery, although there had been limitation of the African slave trade, but nevertheless, slavery was still spreading around the country. And we know that as a result of things that happened in the 1850s, there was a real threat of regression in that area. Along the way, Lincoln has spoken some of the most beautiful words in the English language. Lincoln was a great motivator and inspirer, and that was certainly needed during the crucible of conflict during his 4 years, slightly over 4 years of presidency. Um, Elton Trueblood wrote a book some years ago that I would commend to your attention. Trueblood was a theologian, a professor at Earlham College, and he wrote a book I found fascinating. It was called Abraham Lincoln, Theologian of American Anguish. It was written at the time of the Vietnam War. And he said, there is in the American spirit a deep division and consequent anguish. I thought that's an interesting way of looking at America and Americans. He said, even though Lincoln is not easy to understand and though answers are never simple, and it's true, Lincoln was a tricky guy and always thinking and operating on multiple levels. But Trueblood said, a new possibility of understanding him arises because of the similarity between our time and his. Again, there is in the American spirit deep division and consequent anguish. The chance that his thinking may illuminate our own is a good reason for his examination. True today? I certainly think so. Um, Another thing that attracted me to Lincoln is the fact that his entire life is wrapped up in different forms of conflict. Conflict within himself, within his life, that he had to grapple with during all of his life. A law practice, politics, and then finally, of course, as our president during our country's greatest conflict. So, we're going to talk a little bit today about his law practice on the circuit, and a practice that actually included what we would call today major corporate litigation, like what is known as the F.E. Afton case, a major disaster on the Mississippi River, pitting the railroad interests against the riverine steamboat interests. Then, of course, you have Lincoln the politician. That was really what Lincoln was about, being out on the campaign trail, and of course, most famously in his series of debates in the senatorial campaign of 1858 with Stephen A. Douglas, his arch rival, that set the stage for the presidential campaign of 1860. And then, of course, there is the never ending fascination we all have with the great drama of the Civil War that in some ways continues to play out in this country. And Abraham Lincoln guided the ship of state through all of that. Today, I want to talk about a series of lessons, and I'm going to draw this from different parts of his life and career. These actually are lessons that I think keep recurring in Lincoln's life, but also are relevant to our own. I really tried to start at the beginning. I wanted to look at what made this Lincoln. What do we know about his early life and the key decisions that he made, the key commitments that he made? And one of them is Lincoln's mission statement. In his first political pronouncement, he said, every man is said to have a peculiar ambition. Whether it can be true or not, I can say for one, I have no other so great as that of being truly esteemed of my fellow men by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. I think that last part, that last phrase, may be the most significant element of it. You know, Lincoln, as a young politician, fancied himself perhaps the DeWitt Clinton of Illinois. Everybody was talking about major improvements, canals, railroads, new roads, all of which were necessary on the frontier. Ultimately, those improvements occurred, but not before the state was almost bankrupted. Lincoln and a lot of other politicians were somewhat chastened because they were frankly head over heels over improvements, and they weren't terribly prudent about the way that they tried to budget money to make it happen. It wasn't until the 1850s that Lincoln filled that box, that fleshed out that mission. And it was based on, of course, the fight about slavery, and it was triggered by none other than Lincoln's own arch rival. But Lincoln didn't keep points by how much money he made. He didn't keep points strictly by how popular he was. And in fact, when you look back, you read about Lincoln day by day during his presidency, there was probably no president more vilified, none, than Abraham Lincoln. And the fact is that he was looking at something bigger. And ultimately, that is why Lincoln is so special to us today. A second lesson is really about what we bring to the table in all kinds of conflict. Conflict can be viewed as a very negative thing, but frankly, it's inherent in human life, and it's also the way things happen. It's also the way change is made, that people move forward, maybe improve their own selves and their lives and those of others. That's certainly true with Lincoln. But Lincoln first had to work on himself. When you look at Lincoln, you see all these wonderful attributes. Lincoln was certainly an outlier in many positive ways. Uh, we know that he was extremely intelligent, very analytical. He was tall, he was big, he was imposing. Uh, he was an avid reader. He had wonderful humor, skill at storytelling. People liked him. The village of New Salem, they kind of adopted him. They took care of him. Why? Because he was likable. He was also a person of tremendous ambition. As Herndon said, the little engine that knew no rest, and could demonstrate empathy. But he had challenges. Lincoln was, in many respects, a very insecure person, despite the fact that he had a sense of destiny about where he was going and what he might contribute in history. Nevertheless, we know that he was very socially awkward. He was very uncomfortable, particularly in romantic situations. He had a wit that sometimes was used as a weapon, and while somebody off at the knees or attempting to, it could backfire on him, as we're going to see. Um, Another thing that to keep in mind about Lincoln, besides the fact that he had to work on his challenges, was the fact that he sought improvement of his mind by what he read. He was very careful about the things he put into his brain. Of course, the Bible was one of the very few things that most cabins would have in the way of books. He also established an early love for Shakespeare's plays, something that he used throughout his life. Of course, the Bible, as we know, was the starting point or the linchpin for some of his greatest political pronouncements and the way he framed his speeches. Biographies of leading Americans, George Washington, Ben Franklin, Henry Clay, and other books were extremely important to him, including poetry or books of humor that he would use to not only amuse himself, but try to ward off that depression that was always with him. Ben Franklin, I think, was a particular model. In many ways, were Lincoln. They were a lot alike in that they rose up from limited means. They both liked to write in the newspaper, and of course, Franklin was an editor. They liked to make fun. They liked to try to work on improving themselves in many different ways. Um, so Lincoln has to be traced back to those roots, and it's important to really look at what he read and read it the way he did and try to understand the impact that it would have. He'd do this in a focused way throughout his life. Um, Lincoln believed that he was a very rational person. Now, this didn't always help him, for example, in the area of romance. But Lincoln tried to be logical and rational. Now, they used to joke about the fact that Lincoln would carry around a book of Euclid or Euclid's geometry on the circuit. And he would actually lie awake at night and by the light of the oil lamp read Euclid's book. Um, So here's Lincoln speaking to people about passion and trying to avoid uh, a passionate approach, forsaking emotion in favor of a logical and rational and reasoning approach when it comes to our political institutions. Lincoln at the Men's Lyceum in Springfield gave his first recorded talk. And I think it's important for us to pay attention to it in our present circumstances. Now, keep in mind, this is the late 1830s. The abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy, who was a newspaper editor, had just been murdered, had been lynched by a mob in Alton, Illinois, not far from where Lincoln was practicing and as a politician. And Lincoln uh, spoke about the dangers of what he called mobocracy. He said there's an increasing danger for the law pervading this country to substitute passion for the courts, savage mobs instead of ministers of justice. He said, by operation of this mobocratic spirit, the our democracy may be undermined because when people see mobs take action and the mobs are not punished and put into their place, it lessens people's respect for and expectations of government. It undermines the foundation of government. He also said, and I think he probably was thinking about his own ambition and those of others. He said, people think about the founders and they compare themselves to the founders. They think, can I be as famous as they were? We need to be aware of people who only care about fame, making a splash however they do it, whether it's getting rid of slavery or imposing slavery, or uh, improving democracy or destroying it. He's saying there are people of the loftiest genius, as he puts it, and ambition sufficient to push it to its utmost stretch. Uh, and we have to be aware of these people. We have to be aware that these people are the ultimate danger to democracy, and combined with a mobocratic spirit, maybe suicide for our republic. So he said we have to be governed by sober reason. We need to abide by the law, and we need to forsake emotion in our politics and in our justice. Not surprisingly, Lincoln tried to be very objective in assessing issues in law practice and as well as political positions, and was very much aware of the impact of bias. We know that today a lot of research has been done on commitment bias and the fact that in our brains we filter uh, information in a way that contributes to our own prejudiced views or biased views about things, and we have to be careful about this. There's a lot of study that has been done recently about so-called judgmental overconfidence by lawyers. Randy Kaiser and others have brought together some of this research, and I think it's very, very valuable to look at our present posture. The fact is that Lincoln, for one, tended to be pretty objective as far as we can tell. Clearly, we can't look at all of his cases, but I'm going to give you some examples of how Lincoln encouraged his clients to try to deal with conflict. He, for one thing, we know that he said discourage litigation, which we'll get to in a minute. I simply want to point out a chart that many of you will be familiar with, and that is what's known as the Thomas Kilmann conflict mode chart. Lincoln was probably all over this chart at various points. We know that various approaches may have more of an impact or more focused on achieving one's own interests in a conflict situation. Other people in other circumstances may be more responsive to the interests of others. And so we have the vertical axis being looking at our own interests and trying to further those, and the horizontal axis being responsive to others' interests. Now, a lot of lawyers I know function in a very competitive way. and they may adopt different approaches, different tactics, different strategies to get as much as possible in what they consider to be a distributive game, and leaving as little on the table for the other side. So it's kind of an all or nothing approach uh, in competition. Other people avoid conflict. I know a lot of law students who tend to be conflict avoiders, which is interesting. And maybe you and I, in different circumstances, may say, I don't want to get into conflict in that realm. I want to simply leave everything as it is. I'm just going to walk away from the problem. Well, that sometimes just involves kicking the can down the road. Then there are people that accommodate, just saying, whatever you want, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to let you do whatever you want, and I'm not going to try to worry about my own interests in this. It's worth it to me, I guess, to let you have your way. And of course, then there's compromise, uh, where everybody gets something, everybody gives something. And finally, collaboration, which is uh, is sort of the focus of the book Getting to Yes that many of us know, where we try to find a, an approach that actually is a win-win approach where everybody gets something. Well, Lincoln was all over that chart, but Lincoln tended to say, let's eschew adversarial approaches, particularly litigation, and try to get things worked out informally. He said, discourage litigation. Now, this is somebody who was a very active trial lawyer, and he was probably an even better appellate lawyer and handling major litigation in some cases. But he said, you know what? It's better to persuade people to compromise whenever you can, because the nominal winner in a court case is often the real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time. And as a peacemaker, morally, we can be better people, uh, and there'll still be business enough. He's like the poster child for everything we teach and talk about and practice in our modern era. This is someone who, again, was capable of pursuing very extensive and complex litigation. But he's saying, watch out. He knew, as in this case, Canaan versus Kelly, that sometimes you would lose tremendous time and take tremendous effort to try to get a result. And even if you got a result that was favorable in court, it might take forever to recover a debt. So here you see Lincoln saying to a client, look, it doesn't make any sense for you to continue fighting this case. I don't think you're going to win. I think you're going to lose. Let it go. Here's another one where he's counseling a client. You know, we'll sue this person, but we think these are honorable people. They're just hard pressed. You're probably not going to get paid anyway. Let's wait and see what happens. Lincoln also, in a series of notes he wrote for other lawyers, he said, never stir up litigation. A worse man can scarcely be found than one who does this. You know, Lincoln had been a debtor. He inherited the debts of a store that he maintained, and it took him a long time to pay off what he called the national debt. At one point, also, his father in law's business partners sued him, alleging fraud on his part. Now, he eventually won in court, but that stung him. That really, really bothered him that someone would actually accuse him of fraud. And I think it helped him really empathize with a lot of people who were engaged in litigation and thinking about its limitations. Lincoln, over and over again, tried to encourage cooperative resolution. And here's just an example or two. He's saying to a client, I understand Mr. Hickox is going to meet you to settle the difficulty about the wheat. I hope you'll settle it. I think you can, for I've found him to be a fair man. Isn't it interesting that in so many cases, Lincoln was part of a community and knew parties on both sides? So he could comment with some certainty about what a person might or might not do. He said, if you settle this case, I'll charge nothing for what I've done. I think you ought to settle it. I'll thank you to boot. And by settling, you'll most likely get your money sooner and with much less time and trouble. Here's another one where he says, "A stitch in time may save nine in this matter." Another interesting thing about Lincoln, and not just Lincoln, but some of his compatriot lawyers at this time, was how they would often think about the real interests of their clients. A lot of the research I've done is about reputations. Reputation is on the line in a particular case. Lincoln recognized going to court wasn't necessarily good for anybody's reputation. Let's face it, court days, everybody loved because they would come, they'd see their neighbors, then they'd go into the courtroom and they'd hear testimony, which would be like salacious gossip about the malfeasance or the bad acts of their neighbors. Lincoln recognized that in a case, let's say, where someone has alleged slander, say they have been defamed by another party who has accused them of bad business practices or immorality, might backfire if they took it to court because it would simply convey no benefit for a person's reputation and might, in fact, make things much worse. So, what would happen? Well, in a case like Moran versus Baddeley, they would actually arrange, that is, the lawyers would get together and they would arrange for a confession of judgment by the defendant. So, in a slander case, someone says, "I've been unfairly labeled as immoral or uh, uh, bad business practices." Well, a way to get around that and hopefully take some steps toward restoring reputation was to say the defendant will agree, "Yeah, I was wrong. I was wrong. I'm going to confess judgment. I owe you $2,000 or whatever the claim was." However, no money would be paid. The key was, in essence, getting an apology, getting an acknowledgement by the slandering party that I was mistaken, I was wrong, and you're right. You're a good person. Um, Lincoln also employed other creative approaches in resolving clients' goals. Now, one of the big findings just in the last couple of months that I have made in looking at Lincoln's thousands of cases is to see that in many cases, Lincoln and other lawyers employed arbitration, which is out of court adjudication in a private setting. Dozens of cases, almost 70, were submitted to arbitration by Lincoln and his partners in post dispute agreements, and those were readily enforced by courts in most cases. He had something like 6 or 7 arbitrations in his first year of practice. This continued throughout his practice, all the way up until he became president. All kinds of cases were submitted to arbitration. Disputes between mill owners, debt cases, partnership issues, claims over property, boundary lines, everything. Usually, someone would file suit, and then somewhere along the line, the lawyers would get together and say, "Let's create an arbitration agreement and move everything out of the court and into arbitration." Now, why would they do this on the frontier? Well, it's especially important because on the frontier, in most communities, you'd only have court sessions twice a year. So if you had a dispute and you wanted to get it resolved, it was better to go ahead and do that and use people that you appointed. The parties could agree on. We'll get a neighbor, maybe a lawyer, maybe not. Maybe it's the local justice of the peace, and we will agree by contract that they're going to arbitrate this case, and we'll get it resolved. Sometimes there would be one arbitrator, sometimes there'd be three. And it was funny how often they did this, and they did it readily. So you had a variety of people from the community who were actually serving as their judges, but they're doing it privately. They're not doing it on a court schedule. They're not tied to a court docket. And then the courts would turn around and enforce these things. Arbitrator fees were typically very low, a couple of bucks maybe. And this was consistent with the expectations of the time. It was more of a giving back activity. Although in at least one case involving a railroad, the fees were much higher. Do you know Lincoln himself was an arbitrator? In one case, they asked him to fix a boundary line. And he was able to do that not only because he had legal background, but because he had surveying skills. So here we see Lincoln's surveying equipment in a museum. The fact is that um, this was one of the beauties of arbitration. You could choose people with special expertise to resolve conflict. Lincoln also used other approaches. If you look carefully, you see that he would often do things that would move a case out of court. So they might have an advisory opinion in a non-binding arbitration just to get something negotiated. In other cases, he actually would move things out of court and do a summary version of the case maybe the night before in a hotel room, like here in the case of Webster versus Angel. He had his friend Judge David Davis, who's the presiding judge at that time in the circuit court, hear a case in an abbreviated form, kind of a mini trial, and they did it at night, probably while with Judge uh, Davis sitting his ample self on his bed, and the lawyers kind of explaining the case, and then they got it resolved, and here was his final decision. Lincoln also, no question about the fact that Lincoln certainly mediated. I think you probably get that sense that Lincoln tried to help mediate negotiated resolutions. And here he actually got himself uh, labeled as a referee to try to resolve a conflict without having to go to court. We know about Lincoln's humor. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Lincoln really believed that humor and narration, telling stories, was a great way to motivate people. We all know about that. And of course, there are famous stories about Lincoln's ability with a jury, like the so-called Almanac case, where he represented a defendant, Duff Armstrong, who supposedly had murdered someone with a knife by the and there was a witness who said, I saw it all happen by the light of the moon. And Lincoln came in and famously showed, looking at the Farmer's Almanac, that by the time the alleged murder occurred, the moon had set. So it was not possible to have enough light in that setting for the witness to be able to see it. Of course, people that were there said, well, that's part of it. But actually, Lincoln's final summation to the jury may have had as much or more to do with the final result than anything else. Another thing Lincoln did that I was very impressed with, since I do a lot of arbitration and I've seen a lot of lawyers and what makes a lawyer effective, is the fact that Lincoln was prepared to give up points in the trial of a case. He'd say, "Yeah, I reckon maybe you're right about that. Maybe I'm wrong. I'll give up a point. I won't try to win every procedural point in the process." One of Lincoln's great colleagues over the years was Leonard Swett. And Swett said Lincoln was wise as a serpent in the trial of a cause, because by giving away 6 points, but carrying the seventh point, he carried his case, because the whole case hanged on the seventh point. He traded away the stuff he didn't need. And I've always thought that's a very, very important thing in many settings, just to say, look, I'm reasonable. I know nobody's right all the time. But when it was important, he would win. He also said, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall. And if you would win a man to your cause, convince him that you're a friend. Now, again, Lincoln is known for his stories. He said this is a way of influencing people, getting them to do what you want them to do. I want to tell you one story, which I think is perhaps one of my favorites, about how Lincoln used his humor and his storytelling ability to really, as they say, skin a political opponent. Now, there was a man named Charles Forquer who had been a fellow Whig. He was part of the same party as Lincoln. And then all of a sudden, he switched parties. People wondered, well, why did he suddenly become a Democrat? Well, shortly after he switched parties, he was given a very lucrative position in state government. People said, now we know why he switched parties, because the ruling party at that time was the Democratic Party. He also built himself a huge house, and it had a lightning rod on top, which was something that people weren't used to seeing. But it was, a modern innovation. Well, Forquer made the mistake of insulting Lincoln in the middle of a debate. Well, Lincoln was angry at Forquer anyway for switching parties. He thought that was despicable. So he didn't like Forquer. So he gets up on the platform after Forquer has spoken, and he said, I'm not so young in years as I am in the tricks and trades of a politician. But live long or die young. I would rather die now than, like the gentleman, change my politics and with the change receive an office worth 3,000 a year and then feel obliged to erect a lightning rod over my house to protect a guilty conscience from an offended God. Uh, Forquer really, really got the worst of that. And in fact, people used to talk about the skinning of Forquer in that community for years afterward. We're still talking about it today. Lincoln also was known for his pseudonymous letters. He would write letters to the Sangamo Journal political newspaper, and he would make fun of the other party and other politicians. And he would go under a number of different names. Now, this is where we just have a brief nod to Mary Todd, who, of course, was herself quite a politico. If she'd been a man, she would have been in Congress or have been a governor or a senator, maybe even higher office. But she was certainly a very bright, very politically motivated, and ambitious person, and she chose Lincoln because she had to find someone to fulfill her ambitions. She thought Lincoln had what it took to be a president. Well, many of us may not be aware that Lincoln actually broke up with Mary Todd, and on January 1st of 1841, and for 18 months, they were both in some sense in a suspended animation. But after about 18 months, Lincoln recovered his willpower, as he would say. He ultimately decided that it was best for he and Mary Todd to move forward with their relationship. Now, what happens when two politicos get back together? How do they romance each other? I would suggest, no matter what else happened, they're talking politics. And they both began talking about the man on the right, a man named James Shields, who was then the Illinois state auditor. Now, it turned out that there were some state policies that Lincoln and Mary Todd did not approve of, nor did the whole Whig Party, and people were pretty upset that the state government would not accept state paper, state script, that is, notes that would represent money value. The state would not accept its own script to pay taxes. So this was a great opening for Whig politicians. Well, so Lincoln is talking about how what a stupid political move that was on the part of Shields. Mary Todd says, "Well, let me tell you something. All the women think Shields is a stuffed shirt. He's got a huge ego. He thinks he's God's gift to women. He tends to come up and pinch people on the arm or elsewhere, and we don't like that. In fact, one of my friends stabbed him with a knitting needle, and that really told him how we felt. Well, what happened? A series of letters appeared in the local paper. They were pseudonymous. At least one was written by Lincoln and another by Mary Todd, but you could see both of their hands in the letters. And Lincoln was actually challenged to a duel. And in fact, they ended up, like Hamilton and Burr, on in another state, on the bank of a river, on a dueling ground. Lincoln chose broadswords, trying to avoid any serious damage to either party because he hoped to disarm Mr. Shields. Well, at the last minute, a mediation occurred. A crowd of their friends came, stopped the whole thing, made Lincoln apologize, made Shields accept it, and they moved on. Now, I think this is a significant moment because what you see is no more pseudonymous letters cutting off people at the knees. Lincoln begins to evolve as a different kind of politician. The nastiness is replaced by an effort to try to separate the people from the problem. And I want to point out just a few examples of this later in Lincoln's life. Here in the Lincoln Douglas debates, he made a great speech at Peoria where he's saying slavery is wrong. And the Kansas Nebraska Act, which uh, Douglas had sponsored, is actually going to spread slavery into the territories in ways that we never agreed it should be. So that's wrong, and I'm totally against it. But what he did, he started his speech by saying, I don't propose to question the patriotism or assail the motives of any man or class of men. I'm going to confine myself to the problem. The problem is the extension of slavery. Uh, and then he later said in the same speech, look, my problem is not with the Southern people. This is a joint problem we've all had ever since slaves were brought here. If we were Southerners, we might feel the way they do. And we've got a real problem here that we have to work together to solve. So I'm separating the people from the problem, just like we hear about in Getting to Yes. Um, Here's another example that sort of bridges between Lincoln's law practice and his presidency. One of Lincoln's big cases was going to be McCormick versus Manny. You've heard of the McCormick Reaper? Uh, there was a uh, there was a dispute over intellectual property rights dealing with the McCormick Reaper. Lincoln was asked to represent the other party against Cyrus McCormick, etc. And so this was going to be a big case, very, very important case on intellectual property. It was supposed to be held in Chicago. That's one of the reasons they hired Lincoln. But then it got held in Cincinnati. Well, some Eastern lawyers were also hired. And when Lincoln showed up in Cincinnati for the trial, they totally ignored him. They refused to accept the memo that he wrote about the case. They left him cooling his heels, sitting in the audience at the trial. And I can tell you, it must have been a very chastening experience for Lincoln. He came home to Springfield, and of course, how would you feel? He was an experienced attorney at the time. This is late in his law practice, but he'd been treated like an ignoramus, a local yokel from Illinois. These people really, really insulted him. Flash, uh, Flash forward 2 or 3 years. Lincoln is now president. He's dealing with a war. He needs a new secretary of war. He wants to get the best man for the job. Who does he choose? He chooses Edwin Stanton, one of the lawyers that treated him so badly in Cincinnati. Now, imagine if you're a president and you have a choice of anyone in the country to put in this place. Would you choose someone who treated you the way Stanton treated Lincoln? It's certainly a real tribute to Stanton's skills and talents, but I think it's an even bigger tribute to Lincoln because Lincoln set his ego aside. We know that in many cases, Lincoln did this. Why? Because there were bigger things. He would ultimately triumph. He would win out if the Union could be preserved. But that was all he had the luxury of thinking about. He said, I tried not to put a thorn in the bosom of any man. Think about that. Move that to the present day. I try not to put a thorn in the bosom of any man. He also wrote a letter to uh, to a young officer who actually happened to be the nephew of Stephen Douglas, his old friend and arch rival. And this man had been court-martialed because he had assaulted an officer. And Lincoln gave a pardon, but he said, "Listen to me, son. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self control. Yield larger things to which you can show no more than equal right, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. Choose your battles carefully. Recognize that getting down in the mud in a dogfight is going to make everybody muddy. Strive to develop and abide by a moral compass and be open to change and evolution." Now, we could talk forever about Lincoln and his presidency, but I want to touch on a couple of things. I truly believe that Lincoln was just the right man to step in when he did and to carry the Union through the war, to preserve the Union, and ultimately to bring about the end of slavery. There are many, many other directions this could have gone. Here, Lincoln, in the time leading up to the uh, um, presidential campaign of 1860, said, "So, Republicans, I say, do not give in, do not compromise." Now, here's a situation where Lincoln is saying, we have to draw a line. Contrast this from so many other cases we've talked about. Do not seek some middle ground between right and wrong. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. Now, what Lincoln at the time was saying is we have to draw the line on slavery. We cannot allow it to move into further territories, either in the continental US or in Latin America, which a lot of secessionists wanted to do. He's saying, let's draw a line in the sand on this particular issue because it's critical. This is the only way we can ever be called God's chosen people. In fact, he said, America is really God's almost chosen people. But how can we ever be anything but hypocrites if we continue to allow slavery to develop and fester throughout our country? But I can't constitutionally interfere with slavery in the states where it exists, but I can prevent it from spreading. He said, I think there should be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. If there be, all our labor is lost and ere long must be done again. The dangerous ground, that into which some of our friends have a hankering to run, is popular sovereignty, which of course was what Stephen Douglas was advocating. Let people decide, slavery up, slavery down. It's just another political issue. Lincoln said, no, it's not. Have none of it, stand firm. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter. Well, a year into the war, the butcher's bill was mounting significantly. Lincoln had lost his own son. You could probably consider Willie Lincoln a war casualty because he died of typhoid. This is probably because of contaminated water that may have been spread from Union troops. Now, Lincoln is trying to figure out, what are we going to do in this war? Lincoln said, I could no longer avoid the unavoidable fact at the heart of this war, which is black slavery. He said, I have to figure out what I'm going to do. Over and over again, Lincoln was trying to hold a middle ground on slavery. He said, well, we want to prevent its extension, but we can't do anything about it constitutionally in the states where it exists. But all of a sudden, he's going through a very, very important period of introspection, of moral and spiritual um, uh, investigation, and he's trying to think, what can we do? And all of a sudden, he comes up with the idea of emancipating slaves in the areas controlled by the Confederacy. And he's thinking about this on several different levels. He's thinking, this may be a way that I can change what in modern dispute resolution we call the BATNAs, the best alternatives to a negotiated resolution. Maybe I can put the South in a no-win situation. by taking away one of their greatest assets, the 4 million people who are enslaved in the South. And I believe after much introspection and prayer, I think this is what God intends. It's not what we started with when this war began. We thought we would have a quick and easy and straightforward victory, but we're not. What's going on here? What is expected of us? As a nation, we must do more. We must expiate our national sin, which is slavery. And this is what Lincoln is saying in a note that he wrote to himself, not public, to say, I don't know what God intends, but I think God expects that our country will move forward by expiating slavery. And of course, out of all of this comes the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this changed the whole character of the war. Now it was a fight for keeps. But another thing that changed is Lincoln's whole perspective about Black people and their contributions to the country and what should be done. He'd always had trouble figuring out, well, what do we do about this race issue? Can we live together at all? Don't we need to just simply let them go back to Africa, colonize if possible? But now Lincoln is saying things like, when peace is achieved, it will be because of the Black contribution. Almost 200,000 soldiers and sailors in uniform, who many of whom are freed slaves. There will be some Black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and a well-poised bayonet, they've helped mankind to this great consummation. And of course, out of this comes Lincoln's reframing of the purpose of the war, those monumental words that ended the Gettysburg Address. But of course, Lincoln still had a major battle to fight. You had the election of 1864 that Lincoln very nearly lost. But through it all, people said, look, can't you compromise on the issue of slavery? That's the only way you're going to be able to win. You've got to give ground. People are tired of this war. Well, Lincoln held on. He said, there have been men who proposed to me to return to slavery, the Black warriors, to their masters to conciliate the South. I should be damned to time and eternity for so doing. If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motives. Even the promise of freedom and the promise being made must be kept. And Frederick Douglass says, Lincoln accomplished his goals. He said, viewed from, and this is Douglass speaking of himself, he said, early on, I said, I was an abolitionist. I wanted to get rid of slavery. Totally. I thought Lincoln was behind his time. He wasn't aggressive enough. It turns out that he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined when the time came, when the push came. So no one could have, according to Douglass, done it like Lincoln did. Now, the final, perhaps, irony, the paradox here, is that after all of this, there was still one thing Lincoln was about, one other thing, and that is reconciliation of all of us. A magnanimous victor who said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us do all we can to cherish a just and a lasting peace for ourselves and with all nations. Now, we know that at this time, that when Lincoln delivered that second inaugural, where he's talking about reconciliation of all Americans, he had no idea he had only 6 weeks to live. During that time, however, he witnessed the ending stages of the war, the defeat of Lee's army, the capture of Richmond. And during this time, he told his commanders, with respect to the Southern troops, let them up easy. We have to remember that we're all brothers and we have to bring them back into brotherhood. And that is critical. At the beginning of the week where he was killed, Lincoln made one final speech one evening at the White House. Lincoln talked about reconciliation, about how we might move forward. and how he would look for ways for the states to come back together, for people to recreate the states in a way that would avoid the problems of the past. He also talked about the new role that Black Americans might play for the first time at the table. They seem like very halting steps, like, well, let's let the soldiers vote, or let's let some people like Frederick Douglass have a vote. But he was searching his way to say, what does it mean to be a Black American citizen? And what must we do to deal with that? All of these issues in tension with each other. And yet, the great mind of Lincoln comprehended them all. On this birthday of a great American, let us all rejoice in the life and career and contributions of Abraham Lincoln. Thanks. I
Thank
don't
you
know.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Tom. That was
Yes.
amazing.
Yes, that was incredible. I feel like I've just eaten a big meal, something delicious already, but with my brain. Thank
Brain
you.
meal. I
Yes,
thought I knew a lot about Lincoln, but there was a lot that I just learned from that presentation.
right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I made a comment in the chat. I'm walking away from this feeling very inspired about just being more intentional and aware, right? The the food that I put into my brain, what it is that I'm reading and paying attention to, and also aware of the effect of what's coming out of my mouth. That am I thinking long term, even perhaps willing to be criticized in the moment, like you said, Lincoln was during his presidency because he knows long term he's doing the right thing. Like that was beautiful and inspiring. So thank you. You clearly put so much time into this. I know not just for this presentation. I know you've been studying this for decades at this point, and it shows. That was so rich. Thank you.
Well, I deeply appreciate it. I feel very blessed. For me, this journey with Lincoln has been a kind of therapy, and I think it will continue to be. I'm hoping that sometime in the next couple of years, Carly Conklin and I, and Carly, by the way, is one of the very few people who's actually a historian, not only on constitutional issues, but on dispute resolution. So the two of us are making common cause to bring this out as a book. And I hope that it will be therapy for you like it is for me in this very challenging time in our country's history.
I remember sitting with you and a group of students in Beijing, and I remember you saying, I hope someday I have enough time to turn this into a book. I think this is my calling. It's something I'm supposed to do. So I love seeing this now that it's coming to fruition.
Well, I want to do one other thing. I want to acknowledge another great American who's actually here in the audience today. And that is none other than Bill Webster, who I count among my mentors, not just a great friend, but frankly, a great American. And Bill, I think, stands for everything that has made our republic as great as it is. You know, he served both Republican and Democratic administrations. He's been a leading judge, federal judge. He's been head of two important agencies in the federal government, and I think he continues to stand for everything that is best about America and Americans. And Bill, I thank you, and Linda, both of whom are dear friends, for being here today. It means so much because you inspire me like Lincoln does.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, I know that we're at the time at the hour. I apologize. I took quite a bit of the time, so I hope I didn't eat up too much of your time asking questions.
None, not at
But
all. It's sweet.
but if people have questions, I'm sure that it will be answered as your book comes out. So we can all turn to that, and I know we're all pretty excited about it. So thank you all so much. And Tom, again, just a huge thank you. Auspicious day, but also an important time to hear all of these lessons. So thank you. And
Well, thank you all
thanks
so
to all of
much,
you.
and God bless you. I enjoyed being with you today, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please feel free to follow up with messages directly to me. You can contact me through Pepperdine or Claire. Send messages to Claire and she can forward them. Okay.
Love to. Yeah.
Anyway, all right.
Thank you,
Thank
Tom.
you.
Be well,
Good.
God bless,
everyone.
God bless you all. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone. You as well. Bye.